All right, let's talk about a massive force that quietly shapes our world, an engine that most of us never see. I'm talking about private equity. It operates pretty much out of sight, but its impact? Oh, it's everywhere, from the stores you shop in to the companies that employ millions. So today, we're going to pull back the curtain and see how this thing really works.
So, to kick things off, just a quick question for you. What do these massive household names, a huge pharmacy chain, a major supermarket, and that roadside assistance company you see everywhere, what do they all have in common? Well, the answer might surprise you. At one point or another, they've all been owned and completely reshaped by private equity firms.
So what is private equity really? At its core, it's pretty simple. You have these specialized firms that go out and pool just enormous amounts of money from big-time investors. Think pension funds or university endowments. They take that capital and they use it to buy companies that aren't listed on the stock market. Then they spend a few years working to make them more valuable, and finally, they sell them, hopefully for a very big profit.
Okay, so here's our game plan for today. First, we're going to nail down what private equity actually is. Then, we'll look at why it's become so incredibly popular. After that, we'll dive right into the playbook, how a deal actually gets done. And we'll finish up with the really big debate. Is this a force for good or something else entirely?
So let's get into the nitty-gritty. What is private equity? The single most important thing to get your head around is that this all happens completely outside of the stock market that you hear about on the news every day. We're talking about the world of private companies. Now, a lot of people get this mixed up, but it's really important not to confuse private equity with venture capital. They are totally different beasts. VCs, they're placing these high-risk bets on brand new startups, hoping one of them becomes the next big thing. Private equity does the exact opposite. It goes after mature, established companies. And instead of taking a small piece of the pie, they buy a controlling stake. And this is key, they use a lot of debt to juice the deal, all with a laser focus on boosting profits right now.
And you might be thinking, well, how big is this private world anyway? The numbers are kind of staggering. While all the news headlines are focused on the public stock market, an incredible 99% of U.S. companies with more than 20 employees are privately owned. That is the massive, basically invisible ocean where private equity firms go fishing.
Okay, so this brings up a huge question, right? If this world is so hidden, why has so much money, we're talking trillions, poured into private equity? What is the big allure here?
Well, the answer really boils down to money. Just look at this number, $8.5 trillion. That is how much private equity firms were managing in the middle of 2023. This is not some little niche market. This is a central pillar of the entire global financial system. So why the flood of cash? It's simple, really. Performance. If you just look at the returns over the long haul, private equity has consistently, and I mean consistently, beaten the public stock market. Now, if you're a pension fund or a big investor who absolutely needs to make your money grow, that kind of track record is almost impossible to ignore.
Okay, so we know the what and the why. Now, let's talk about the how. How do they actually do it? How does a deal work from start to finish? Well, it all comes down to a classic strategy, the PE playbook.
The go-to move, the bread and butter of private equity, is something called the leveraged buyout, or LBO. Here's how it works. First, the PE firm raises a giant fund. Then, and this is the really crucial part, they use a small slice of their own money and a huge amount of borrowed money, debt, to buy a company. Then, they spend the next 4 to 7 years actively trying to improve its operations. And finally, they sell the company, pay back all the debt, and hopefully walk away with a huge profit. Look, the absolute best way to wrap your head around leverage is to think about buying a house with a mortgage, right? You might only put down, say, 20% of your own money, but you control 100% of the house. So if that house's value goes up by just 10%, your return on your initial investment is actually 50%. That incredible amplification of returns is exactly why PE firms love to use debt. But, and this is a really important but, it's not just about fancy financial footwork. The next phase is all about creating genuine, real value in the company they've just bought. And this is where that active ownership part really comes into play. Right, so a PE firm doesn't just buy a company and then sit back and hope for the best. No
way. They roll up their sleeves and get to work with a whole toolkit of changes. One of their biggest advantages is that by taking a company private, they free it from what's called the tyranny of quarterly earnings reports. This gives them the breathing room to make huge, long-term changes, bringing in entirely new leadership, overhauling operations from the supply chain all the way to marketing, and putting in a board of directors that is laser-focused on one thing and one thing only: performance. Which brings us to the big one, the really contentious section, the great debate. Is private equity this incredible engine of efficiency and growth, or is it something far more destructive? You hear a lot of really strong language around this industry, and this quote from U.S. Senator Elizabeth Warren, well, it pretty much sums up the critical view. The term vulture capitalists paints a picture, doesn't it? That these firms prey on weak companies, pick them apart for profit, and just leave the carcass behind. And there's some real weight behind this criticism. Critics point to major retail bankruptcies, famous stores that just disappeared after PE buyouts, leading to massive job losses. They highlight the immense debt that gets loaded onto the company itself, which can make it incredibly fragile. You hear accusations of asset stripping, selling off a company's crown jewels for a quick buck. And there's a lot of concern about the impact on critical sectors like healthcare, where some studies have linked PE ownership to worse patient outcomes. But of course, that is not the whole story. On the other side of the coin, proponents argue that private equity is a powerful, powerful force for good. They say it takes underperforming or stagnant businesses and makes them better, leaner, and more competitive. By taking companies private, they give them the space to make tough but necessary changes. They inject capital for growth that might not be available anywhere else, and they offer founders a way to sell their business and see it thrive in its next chapter. So, why should you care about any of this? Because whether we see it or not, private equity's influence is just vast. It shapes the fate of the stores on our main streets, it can affect the quality of care in our local nursing homes, and because pension funds are the biggest investors in PE, it directly impacts the retirement savings of millions upon millions of people. And that leaves us right back at the fundamental question, the big debate at the heart of it all. Is private equity a creator of new economic value, making the whole pie bigger for everybody? Or is it simply a master of capturing existing wealth, just slicing that pie up differently to make sure its investors get the biggest piece? The answer, it seems, is really complicated, and it probably depends on which company, which deal, and which outcome you happen to be looking at.